Ben Bradley.
Speaker, to the great frustration of my staff, I've sat here listening through this debate and been taken to thoughts and memories of my own that have led me to cross out almost the entirety of my speech and have probably wasted a lot of their afternoon. But as I so often find in this place, particularly when you only end up with a very short time to speak, I will skip kind of duplicating what others have said and perhaps stick to those personal experiences. I did want to just pay tribute, as many others have, to both my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, and her incredibly considered, experienced and passionate speech earlier on. And this really should be considered, though many people have worked on this issue, a real flagship and a real bastion of her time in Number 10, a hugely important legacy for her as an individual, as well as for this House, and also obviously to the member for Canterbury for what was an incredibly passionate and moving speech that took me back actually to an experience that I will mention shortly, but has every right and reason and deserves to lead the news later on, and I'm sure that it won't, because once again Brexit will kick it off the agenda. But it should, and it was incredibly important in its own right, and I think that speech in its own right will help people, even aside from this legislation. I say it reminded me of something. I recently ran the Mansfield 10K, which also made me cry, but in a slightly different way. That was a painful cry, the 10K, but I survived it nonetheless. I've been working with them for 2 years since I was elected. And they, like so many charities around the UK, help people in their time of need. They've helped over 5,000 people in Mansfield and Ashfield alone over those 5 years. And to consider those figures, this is an area of 180,000 people roughly, and in just 5 years they've supported 5,000 people, just goes to show the extent of how much this is an issue in my part of the world. Some of the worst figures around domestic abuse anywhere in the country. And my honourable friend, the Minister, the member for Louth and Horncastle, came to visit NIDAS, which, if I haven't said already, stands for Nottinghamshire Independent Domestic Abuse Services. And we had a really both interesting time, I think, and also hearing about the services they provide, but also a very emotional one. And I've found myself increasingly emotional since I had children, and I don't like to admit sometimes how much so. But I sat in that room crying, listening to the accounts of some of the women in particular who had been supported by that charity, and particularly one piece of creative writing that one of the women had done through her therapy supported by that charity that was really, really moving. And as I say, the contribution from the member from Canterbury brought me back to that. I thought I would recount that experience. And the second thing I want to raise, aside from the obvious benefits that many have discussed in the Chamber, whether that's preventing victims of domestic abuse from being cross-examined by the perpetrators, whether that is the creation of the new Domestic Abuse Commissioner role, which I hope will ensure that this focus and scrutiny continues long after we stop talking about this bill in this place. The other one that brought me back to a personal experience was the idea of broadening and defining the domestic abuse definition in law. The member for Swansea East on the opposition front bench mentioned older people and how over 75s don't necessarily get the same support. An example from a very working class community that I represent, you go back to a lot of people who are married in the 50s and 60s, where husbands would have had the money and paid their wives a housekeeping allowance on a weekly basis, and in many parts of my community that's still the case. Something that we don't necessarily see or recognise, but that actually we all in this chamber probably would look at these days and think that's unacceptable, but it still persists and we don't even notice it in many cases. So just an example that the opposition front bench as a point brought back to me as something that we can now prevent, hopefully through the passage of this bill and through that clear definition, to help some of those women to be able to come forward and say, actually, I now realise that this isn't right. And obviously there's a more detailed debate through committee to get all of this right. We know, as my right honourable friend mentioned briefly in an intervention earlier on, that even a tiny reduction in domestic abuse makes this bill pay for itself. If these measures can make anybody feel safer or bring perpetrators to justice, then it will have done its job. And I trust for that reason that it will have unanimous support in the House today.
Naz Shah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I just say, put my thanks on record for the leadership shown by both the front benches on this very, very important bill. Whilst we're debating this, for me, this is really, really personal because domestic abuse has literally shaped everything, what I stand for and what brought me on this journey into Parliament. And it's brilliant that women, hopefully, after this abuse bill will go through, will have services and we